Same terms, absolutely. So my name is Yahya, and my surname is Barry. Thank you very much for the introduction. I am a visiting fellow at the University of Copenhagen at the Center of African Studies. So this morning, as I was preparing for my paper in the waiting room of a reception with my wife, and she's looking at me somewhat concerned, saying, "Not again, you are reading when we're supposed to be waiting for a very important appointment." So I said, "Okay, you know what, let me kill two birds with one stone. Why don't I share with you what I'm going to present today?" And the paper is Role Model Natives, the Influences of Intergroup Contact on Muslim Responses and Perceptions of Right-Wing Populism. I started to unpack this to her, and her response surprised me. She said, "Does that really happen? That Muslim people actually look up to non-Muslims and adopt them as role models?" And I myself was surprised by that, because I suppose I had taken it for granted that such labels, Muslim and non-Muslim, should act as almost binaries, preventing one from seeing or the embodiment of success and the possibility of emulating them and adopting them as role models. But that's because that's what I found during my PhD, looking at Muslim responses to right-wing populism. The context is the rise of populism, whereby such movements and groups have gone from the periphery across the various contexts in Europe and the West to occupying the center. We're seeing how the changing cleavages across the political landscapes of Western Europe and the US, certain cleavages have diminished, such as the socio-economic one, and the social-cultural cleavage becoming more important, whereby factors like immigration, law and order, security have come to the fore, and has created a vacuum whereby certain groups are coming in on this and securing votes for themselves and for their parties. My PhD looked at Muslim responses to this phenomenon, because as a Muslim myself, and especially one trained to represent the faith in a ceremonial official capacity, I felt quite threatened by this. But I did not want to assume a position whereby I wanted to project this insecurity onto my participants. And since we are in a conversation of dialogue, the methodology which I adopted to study this was a participatory method, whereby I did not want to assume that my participants were threatened or indeed saw this phenomenon as anything unusual or unsettling for them. So I did PAR, participatory action research. My participants were 45 in number across 3 European cities, Copenhagen in Denmark, Malmo in Sweden, and Edinburgh in Scotland. I used purposive sampling to break down or to focus on a subgroup of 28 of these participants, because they spoke directly to the phenomenon that I was interested in, namely the second generation Muslims and the converts, because the theory showed that for the first generation, there's always a myth of return. Whereas for the second gen, who are born and raised in Europe, there is more of a direct attachment to Europe, seeing Scotland or Sweden or Denmark as home. And likewise, the indigenous natives who end up converting to Islam have this connection to their lands. So focusing on these two subsets enabled me to start analyzing the data. And instead of approaching my studies from the perspective of looking at this phenomenon, I decided to focus on change. And hence I would ask my participants, how has your identity changed? And by doing that, I thought that I would open up their responses for them to articulate for me what they saw to be really important. When I look at the setup here in this very fascinating workshop that we have seen dialogue being articulated in terms of tensions, in terms of conflict, in terms of spaces, tools, instruments, in the context of COVID. And my contribution to this is dialogue can also come about through relationships. And furthermore, dialogue can also be or should be focused on at the social micro level, because a lot of the focus has been on structural level analysis. So, for example, a lot of the literature that looks at right-wing populism looks at it from the perspective of the parties, the national political systems, the socio-economic forces, etc. And it's excluding those voices at the micro level, the everyday voices, which, when you look at it, they were the origins. I mean, the embryonic right-wing movements emerged to respond to these voices at this level. So how comes in analyzing them and seeking to understand them, we are stuck on the structural macro level? So in focusing on the macro level, looking at these individual voices, I wanted to see, does this have any resonance to my participants, especially the second generation and the convert cohort? The theoretical frameworks that I looked at, first of all, intergroup contact theory, because when we're looking at issues of citizenship, integration, Islamophobia, there are certain dynamics of intergroup behavior that we need to look at. And the second is the role models. So the literature in sociology places role models as within the social learning theory, whereby certain marginalized groups or disadvantaged groups are role models feature as an important aspect of their social learning and of their progress, because these role models are seen as embodying behaviors and successes which can be emulated. And the concept of body is really important because some studies have shown that there's a positive correlation between body, for example, female role models having a positive impact on female students. But some studies, like Brown's study in 2012, contested that. His very interesting case looking at African-American male bodies and saying that there was this whole sort of debate in North America whereby there was a drive to recruit Black African-American teachers because they were seen as being the perfect role models for the underperforming and underachieving African-American students. But this work argued that actually the performance of such individuals was pedagogical. It had nothing to do with race. And so therefore, by making this connection to bodies, it was a kind of fetishization of the Black male body again. And it's been framed in discourses of difference and deviance. So that made me question, okay, if some of my participants are talking about role models, do such Muslims also require Muslim male role models? Or do non-Muslim male role models also suffice for this? My empirical data looks at a number of individuals who took part with my research. My paper looked at individuals such as Mustafa, an unemployed Malmo resident in his early 20s. And his narrative showed how the importance of having a role model, regardless of the religion, was key to his self-identification as a Swedish citizen, beyond just refining or restricting himself to being a Turkish individual. We also had Reem, a mid-20s teacher in Copenhagen of Syrian background, who showcased the absence of having role models and how that could negatively impact self-identification with the nation state, and therefore impact how she saw groups which came to question her sense of belonging. A few quotes from Mustafa. He said, "I had a very great teacher. He had been in the military. He was a bodybuilder and he was very cool and he was a motivational person." I asked him, "And he was a Swedish native?" He said, "Yes, he was Swedish native. He helped me and he was helping another guy I was with. He was also from another background, so we didn't really fit in the class. We really clicked with him because we are also into training and the martial arts. He started to help us weightlifting, gave us tips on what to eat, and he became like a role model." His narrative continued. He said, "I looked up to this guy because when he was our age, he was always taking care of his body and was always training. So I felt from another perspective that you can also be cool and you don't have to drink, you don't have to party, because he didn't do it. He always said, when I was a kid, I didn't go out and do that. I didn't party because I had tournaments. He said he gave us like that focus, saying you could stick with the right people around you and they can help you to focus on your goals. So when I noticed in his narratives, I said to him, it's almost as though you have Islamified your teacher's, his character, that you've recognized him as a role model that you can emulate. And he affirmed in the positive. So I questioned him, did you not find any Muslim role models in your neighborhood? He said, of course there were, but there was a difference in how he could navigate around the space that he was operating in. It was a predominantly Swedish school. The lessons that were imparted to him from these Muslim role models were not always relevant to his situation there. So Mustafa's case was a case of a positive example of positive self-identification with the Swedish nation state, because of the very strong contact that he had with a Swedish native role model. Reem, on the other hand, did not have such a positive experience. She shared, when I was in the 3rd or 4th grade, we had a parent-teaching meeting after gym class so that I would not shower with the rest of the kids because, Muslim rules and stuff. She laughed. I remember the teacher at the end saying, okay, fine. The next time we have gym, you're not going to shower with the rest of the students. However, the teacher broke this promise, and Reem explained. She said, when the teacher told her, you have to shower with the others, I still remember, and she had an emotive tone, what I was wearing, where I was, and everything, because I felt like I was slapped twice. Authorities were like up here. Reem's negative experiences with such individuals or authority shaped her perceptions of and responses to rhetoric, which was questioning her sense of belonging to the nation state of Denmark. Vis-a-vis Mustafa, when I asked him how he perceived the rise of right-wing groups such as the Swedish Democrats, he responded that, firstly, he did not see them to be such a threat. And secondly, he distinguished between xenophobia, which is an irrational or a fear of otherness, against an ideology that is being, let's say, portrayed by certain groups who base their claims to, let's say, in very nativist, exclusivist terms. And he said that he based it again on what his teachers had shared with him and the lessons they had imparted to him. Whereas when Reem shared her experiences and her perceptions of right-wing populism, she framed it in very structural terms, focusing on the school policies, similar to the UK, whereby there's a prevent strategy, where in Denmark, if a child is seen as, let's say, exhibiting particular language, the authorities are almost mandated to monitor that particular child in case they might be radicalized. So these were some of the cases that I came across. Reem had Reem benefited from supportive role models. Her responses would have been perhaps slightly different from Mustafa. And I compared their narratives to some of the other participants across the other European nations that I had studied. To conclude, my article looked at the growing up narratives of the 2nd generation and convert Muslims. And I looked at a number of different factors, such as migration, socioeconomic and individual factors, and how these were shaping the Muslims' perceptions and responses to right-wing populism. There was no particular distinct response as I had expected. Right-wing populism did not initiate or did not evoke any distinct Muslim response of either, let's say, okay, it's time for us to pack our bags and leave, but rather their responses were shaped by 2 factors: the ability to feel at home and the abilities to actually relate to right-wing populism. And the factors of segregation, growing up in segregated areas, which limited contact, and therefore the probability of having native role models impacted their abilities to feel at home securely, and likewise being able to relate to the right-wing populist side and see them for the fears that they may espouse or the reasons behind their ideological and their political thinking. And this very at the very end of it, the theme of second-class citizenship was a real impediment towards that feeling and the ability to feel at home and see the other side. My time is up. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to the discussion.